Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm McKenna. I'm the owner of Murder by the Book in Houston, Texas. Thank you so much for being here tonight for one of our virtual events. As always, we have a busy virtual event schedule. So if you're interested in seeing what's coming up, you can check out our event calendar at murderbooks.com. Also, we have all of our events through the end of September listed, our virtual events listed on Facebook on our events calendar. And we're updating and adding things constantly. We've had some revisions to our schedule, shall we say, with canceling in-store live events that we had scheduled at the beginning of September. All of those have now been canceled and changed to new dates, virtual events. So like I said, new things are popping up every day as we get all that stuff rescheduled and confirmed. And we do have a pretty cool ticketed event coming up at the end of the month. It's Paula Hawkins, the author of Girl on the Train, in conversation with Lee Child. So that is one of our ticketed events. A signed copy of Paula Hawkins' new book is required to take part in the event. Everything else, I think, for the rest of the month is free and just virtual. As always, I'm putting a link in the comments for more information about the authors and their books, or should you be inclined to order them from us. That link is in the comments. And please, please, please don't be shy. All questions are welcome. We have as a guest interviewer tonight, Jason Penter, who's the publisher of Polis and always leads a fantastic discussion. But your questions are welcome, and we'll get to those in a little bit. Okay, I'm going to start bringing on the authors. We're going to start with Dee Poyer. Good evening. How are you?
Great. How are you doing? Thank you for having me.
Of course, it's a pleasure. So I'm going to do your formal bio really quickly, and then we'll bring the next person on. I have had some allergy issues, and my voice is tricky, so I've shortened everyone's bios to try to get through these without coughing, since we've got so many people tonight. So Dee Poyer is the international bestselling author of the Calderwood Cases series. She was raised in Edmond, Oklahoma, where she got her start writing in creative writing courses. Later, she spent time living on both coasts and traveling the United States before finally putting down roots in Central Florida. She now resides somewhere between Disney and the swamp. She spends her days at her day job as a vice president of digital marketing and her nights writing. And she's here tonight to talk about her new book, After You Died. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you.
All right. Next up, we have Meghan Holloway. Hi, Meghan.
Hi, how are you this evening?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having us tonight.
Oh, I love hosting these Polis Agora nights. It's always such a great conversation. And, you know, we believe so much in what Jason and Chantal are doing that we're always happy to host. So let me get you introduced as well. Meghan Holloway found her first Nancy Drew mystery in a sun-dappled attic at the age of 8 and subsequently fell in love with the grip and tautness of a well-told mystery. She's the author of Hiding Place, Hunting Grounds, and Once More Unto the Breach, all available from Polis Books. And then tonight, you're here to talk about Hiding Place. All right. And last but not least, we have JD Dusty Rhodes. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing, McKenna?
I'm doing well. It's good to see you. It's been a really long time.
It has. It's been too long.
Yeah.
We'd love to see you at BoucherCon, but, you know.
C'est la vie. Next year.
Next year.
All right. Born and raised in North Carolina, JD Rhodes has worked as a radio news reporter, club DJ, television cameraman, ad salesman, waiter, attorney, and newspaper columnist. His weekly column in North Carolina's The Pilot was twice named Best Column of the Year in its division. He's the author of 6 novels in his acclaimed Jack Keller series, as well as Ice Chest, Breaking Cover, and Broken Shield. He lives, writes, and practices law in Carthage, North Carolina, and his new book is The Killing Look. I can't wait to hear all about all of these. And the person who's going to do that and tell us all about them and give you great questions is Jason Penter. Hi, Jason.
Hey.
As always, good to see you. Jason Penter is the publisher of Polis Books, also most recently the author of the Rachel Marin series, along with others. I'm going to go away. I'm going to wait for questions. And if you guys need anything, call me back on. I'll be sitting here off camera the whole time. Otherwise, have a great discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thanks to McKenna for the introduction. Thanks to Dee, to Megan, to JD, Dusty. I think we'll call him JD just so everyone who's watching knows who I'm talking about. So first of all, thank you all for doing this. Obviously, you know, we were hoping to sort of do more in-person things, but the way things are going right now, it's great to be able to do this and have people across the country, around the world, watch these events. And if you are watching these events, whether it's live or a replay on Facebook or YouTube, please support Murder by the Book, support independent bookstores, buy books from these authors, buy books from every author. Independent bookstores need this more than ever. It's a tough time for them. So these authors are here to entertain you and tell you stories. So please support them and the bookstores that support them. So now on to business. I'm so thrilled to be here with you three authors, and I want to just sort of kick it off generally. I'd love to hear from each of you about the inspiration behind your new novels. What sort of set the fire? Why did you write this book? So I'll start with Dee. What led you to write after you died?
So actually living in Florida is what led me to write it. I moved to Florida in 2010, and shortly after I moved here, the news was filled with stories about the Dozier School. That's the setting for my book, and it's the real inspiration. A lot of the things that take place in the book actually did happen at the school. So that was my main inspiration. I heard about the terrible things that happened there, and it really sparked something in my mind, and I knew I had to write about it.
Sure. Megan, how about you? What led you to write Hiding Place?
So it's actually the second book in my Hector Lewis trilogy, and I really wanted to explore the psychology of having a family member, a loved one go missing, and having no answers for that, and what that looks like and what that does to a person. And so this is really a continuation of Hector's journey in trying to find out what happened to his wife and daughter 15 years ago.
I love asking all these questions because I kind of know the answers, but I'm always fascinated to sort of hear the authors talk about them as though I don't know the answers. So it's nice to hear. JD, The Killing Look is very much a departure in a lot of ways, and it's absolutely fantastic. So what led you to write it?
Well, I had been writing, as you probably know, Jason, in a subgenre that we sort of jokingly at first dubbed redneck noir, which is dark crime fiction set in the South, and I really enjoy that, and that's where the Jack Keller series really falls. But I was writing, I started writing another book in that vein, and it just seemed like I was doing the same old thing over and over again, and I was starting to get stale. My friend Terrence McCauley had written some very great, fun, dark spy thrillers, but then he started writing Westerns. I'm trying to remember who he's writing for, but anyway, I read a couple of those, and I said, well, I love Westerns. I love Western movies. So I said, well, I'll give this a try. And the more I started doing research into the time, I eventually ended up in 1870s San Francisco. Which is a really fascinating time because some of the same issues they were facing then, huge anti-immigrant sentiment, huge income inequality, huge economic volatility. Fortunes are made and lost in the space of a couple of weeks. And it just really, and then, as COVID sort of started coming in, it became more and more like, well, I don't want to write about now because now sucks really, really bad. But then wasn't exactly a bowl of peaches every day, but it was just such a fascinating time that I just got sort of swept up in that world and swept up in the story of this guy who was a former Union cavalryman. He sort of drifted across the country after the war and ends up in this place that at one point he says, I can't tell if this is a city or an insane asylum, because it was so crazy and was so hectic. So that it really was, so just sort of sum up, the inspiration were desire to do something different, a friend of mine writing Westerns, and stumbling into this really fascinating time and place that's so much like our own.
Mm-hmm. And sort of touching on that, JD, Killing Look is set in 1870s San Francisco. Each of you have written both contemporary novels and books that have a at least partly based in historical fiction too. So I'll start with Megan because how you have Hunting Ground and Hiding Place, but before those, you wrote a book called Once More Under the Breach, which is this fantastic sort of historical drama thriller that's set at the end of World War II. So this is a question for each of you: sort of how do you go between writing historicals or books that have a historical element, like Dee does in After You Died, to writing books that are set contemporary? What's the difference in terms of how you write, in terms of how you research? How do you go between writing historical and contemporary? So Megan, I'll start with you.
I really feel like you're telling very human stories, regardless of what genre and which era you're writing in. And so boiling into that universal tale that people are going to connect with, regardless of whether or not it's set in 1870, 1944, or 2021, I feel like boiling into that and really touching on themes that are universal regardless of what time and place you're writing about. The research for me is what makes the difference between writing a contemporary crime thriller and then a historical thriller. I spend months really diving in from a 60,000 viewpoint all the way down to the ground on what would have been happening in this time and place, what would the culture have been, what would the opinions have been about what's going on, and then really getting down from the presidential level of things to the boots on the ground with soldiers, and so that's really how it is differentiated for me.
Now, this is also a question for all of you, but obviously, how you research now might be very different from even how you researched 2 years ago, just based on what you have access to. What was it like researching Once More Into the Breach? What did you do to sort of recreate, like you said, 1944, when we're living so far away from that? Obviously, there are a lot of resources, but what did you in particular do to try to lend as much authenticity as you could to that time period?
So I really talked with a lot of World War II veterans about their experience in the war. And then I started with World War II research material, reference material. And then I would read biographies about different resistance efforts in the war. I would try to get my hands on as many primary resources as I could. I have a fantastic map of Paris that the Red Cross gave out to soldiers in 1940. I have a manual from the manufacturer of the ambulance that is in my story, a driver's manual that I happened to find at a surplus store in the UK. And it still has these oily fingerprints on the edges of the pages. And so it's something that I feel like really should be in a museum, but I was lucky enough to get my hands on it. And so I would have loved to have actually purchased the ambulance that I wrote about and actually drive it for myself, but there are none in the continental US. And so really trying to talk with the experts. And there's this scene in Vichy, France, and it's about libraries there in World War II. I spoke with one of the archivists from Vichy at the time. She had done a paper on the libraries in the city during World War II. So talking with her, reading her work, and just really trying to talk to as many experts as I could, because there's only so much of myself that I can stretch around and become an expert on myself. So really leaning into those other individuals' expertise and those other experiences.
So, JD, I mean, you talked about how you sort of got the bug to write a Western, and Westerns are obviously sort of one of the most classic genres in I'd say largely American fiction, but also the spaghetti Westerns. They were hugely popular in in the 60s. And I think they've had a bit of a resurgence recently. Obviously, we had the remake of True Grit and a lot of fantastic movies, even video games like Red Dead Redemption.
Deadwood.
How did you go about deciding this was the Western you wanted to write? And then how did you go about researching Gilded Age San Francisco?
Well, I became, as I said, I was originally going to write, more bog standard Western, like, guys in a small town in, Oklahoma or Montana or something like that. And then I just sort of stumbled into all of this stuff about San Francisco. And again, just was struck by what a fascinating time it was and how similar it is. They still had huge, racial and gender issues there at the time. One of the books I'm doing, the sort of follow-up I'm doing, talks about, suffragism sort of taking hold in San Francisco. So I really sort of stumbled onto San Francisco, and again, was really struck by how fascinating a place it was and how chaotic really a place it was. As far as how do I do the research? Yeah, it was completely different from researching, say, The Devil's Right Hand or, Breaking Cover, any of the Jack Keller books, anything like that, because obviously the weaponry is completely different. I got whole books on, the weaponry of the Old West, because one thing we've all learned, from any time writing crime fiction, if you get anything about a gun wrong, you're getting emails. You're getting a lot of emails telling you you're an idiot. You don't know what you're doing. But as far as the sources go, there's a huge wealth of information online about San Francisco. San Francisco Chronicle has a huge website with lots of actual historical documents in it. SF Gate, I think, is what that one is. San Francisco Public Library has a lot of archives online. So there's one site that has actual, you can go to a year and go day by day by day what the story was that day. So there's a wealth of information online about it. There's also a couple of great books. There's one called The Barbary Coast, which is about the area that was sort of the red light district, which was just an absolute stew of decadence and corruption, which is where the book begins, because that's a whole lot of fun. I also stumbled into, because some of the characters in it are Chinese, I ended up finding out some really fascinating things about Chinese history of the time, which is also online, and that gets sort of folded into it later in the book. So again, it was just sort of it sort of took hold of me. Just doing the research really grabbed me and really sort of compelled me to keep working on the book. The only problem was, of course, that I would tend to go down the research hole. I spent like an hour one evening, because I tend to write in the evenings. I spent an hour one evening, trying to find out, okay, this one character gets a folding chair for another. Well, did they have folding chairs in 1870? I had to spend an hour chasing that down. So it tends to go a little slower when you're doing something like that, because if you've got to say, well, wait a minute, would that actually be a thing in 1870 San Francisco? I don't know if that answers your question or not.
I think it does. We can always go back to it. I definitely have more questions, because I want to talk about you talk about the immigration and the racial issues there, and I definitely want to hear more about that. But I want to move on to D. So, a part of After You Died is set in 1968, and you mentioned the Dozier School. What was it like sort of researching something that's, 1968 is technically historical. It's not, that far as back as, 1944 or 1870, but it is a totally different time and place. And you mentioned the Dozier School, the Dozier Academy for Boys. What led you to write part of your book in that time period? And tell us more about the Dozier Academy, because it seems like that was a real jumping off point, and I think there's a real story behind that I want to hear about.
Yeah, so the school was open for a little over 100 years, or maybe a little over 100 years, up in Mariana, Florida, which is like kind of the panhandle of Florida. And basically, since its inception, it had the worst occurrences you can imagine there. In their early days, there were boys that were shackled to bed so they couldn't escape or move. And so they had to go to the school and tell them they can't shackle boys to a bed. They had to be able to actually walk around and move. So the school stopped shackling them at that point. But then there was just a string of abuses basically throughout the entire history. And in 1968, the governor at the time actually stepped in and wanted to do something about the abuses that were happening at the school, and tried to make a phone available to the boys so that they could call the outside world and let them know if there were things taking place at the school that there shouldn't be. Obviously, they did not get the access to the phone that they should have. But I decided to set the book in 1968 because of there was a lot of media coverage around the school at that time. There were a lot of stories that I found online that took place during that time period. Unfortunately, the school was open until 2011, which just baffled me that it took that long for them to shut it down. And, since the school shut down, the state has been exhuming bodies from the grounds that shouldn't have ever been there. The school had told the state that several boys had died from influenza or accidents or trying to escape, and they've found hundreds at this point, or over 100. I don't know the current tally, but there's so much acreage there. We don't even know how many boys will eventually be found and then hopefully matched back to their families at some point.
I mean, that's sort of one of the things I think all three of you tackle in your fiction to some extent is using fictional stories to tell true stories. I think what's part of the reason that I love fiction, that I think a lot of people read fiction, there is obviously a sense of escapism, but it's also a way to tell truths that in a way that sometimes hit you harder than nonfiction. And so I want to go back to JD on that note, because you talk a lot about the immigration and the racial issues in 1870s. And I think that if you look at sort of classic Westerns, the films of the 1960s, they really didn't go into that stuff because I don't think the culture was had progressed to the level it has today. And you tackle those issues really well and really delicately in your book. How important was it for you to not just write a Western, but write a Western that was sort of honest about the era in regards to immigration, in regards to racism, when the people there were almost sort of unaware of it in some ways? So what made that important to you, and how did you go about writing that authentically?
Well, again, because it's so much echoed in our own society right now. Some of the things that were said about the Chinese, I mean, there was one, because in that point it was the Chinese, not Mexicans, even though there was a considerable prejudice against the Mexican community. But the Chinese were brought in basically to work on the railroads, and because they worked cheap and they brought their own food. So they fed themselves. You didn't have to feed them because they didn't want to eat Western food because they thought it was unhealthy, and they had a much lower incidence of disease in the Chinese camps. But anyway, back to some of the exact same rhetoric you'd see from the newspapers of the time. There's one that struck me in particular. Says they bring crime, they bring drugs, they're rapists. I mean, literally echoing the whole thing about the former guy's immigration status or immigration rhetoric. So that really struck me, and it was very important for me to just sort of show the echoes of the immigration and racial issues there, and how there was so little understanding between people, and a lot of denial about whether or not that was actually a thing. As far as one of the characters that becomes important in The Killing Look is Cade's friend, eventually becomes his friend Samuel, who is a servant in the house where Cade gets a job as a bodyguard, and he's very stiff and very formal and very angry. And Cade is like, "What is this guy so angry about? What he's living a good life." And you later find out, what sort of horrible things, he's gone through. So again, it was sort of, the sort of echoes of the times, like, the worst thing a black person can be now, apparently, to some white people, is angry. But you begin to see why, some people are, because of what they've gone through. So again, it's the echoes of some of our current issues, and sort of sometimes you almost go into a certain amount of despair because we haven't solved it. I mean, it's been 130 years, since then. Did I count that right? I don't know. But it's been, over 100 years since that, and we still haven't got these issues right. And maybe we can. I don't know.
Yeah. I'm going to go to Meghan. So, one of the things you sort of touched on, I think one of the things we love about the sort of the crime genre or various other genres is because it can tell those sort of truths. Obviously, there's been sort of a large reckoning, if that's the right word, to some extent, over the past, 1, 5, 10 years about, diversity and about other viewpoints, and how important that all is. Obviously, when you're writing a book, you want to tell a story with captivating characters, and you want to keep the reader's attention for 300-400 pages or whatever it is. How important is it to you to write a story that not just sort of captivates, but also tackles issues that might be important to you or important to readers that sort of go beyond the page? Meghan?
I think that stories have always been one of the best ways to raise awareness for different issues in society. It's always been a platform for people. I mean, look at Charles Dickens talking about the issues with child labor, with the poverty that was so rampant in Victorian England at that time. And so it's always been this voice for being able to speak these hard truths and to show what's wrong in society. I think you have to be really careful when you're doing that, particularly when you're talking about different cultural, different racial tension out there, because a lot of these, as a white writer, it's not my story to tell, and I want to be able to raise awareness about these different issues. Like in my first Hector Lewis book, in Hunting Ground, I talked about this epidemic of invisibility that Native American women and girls are facing, with the amount of women and girls who are going missing at almost a daily rate, and there's just not the news coverage that there is. And so I really wanted to be respectful of these different issues, and be sensitive about this, but also be able to show that, hey, there's this tremendous issue that's going on that we know very little about, and we should know about it, and we should be talking about it.
And Dee, obviously you talked about sort of the horrors at the Dozier Academy. You're shining a light on, these real life atrocities. Did you find you had that much, because these are real life issues and because they actually continued up until fairly recently, did you find you had a certain responsibility to sort of tell these stories authentically? How important was it to you to, like I said, tackle these stories that obviously go well beyond the fictional page?
For me, it was of the utmost importance to honor the victims that suffered at the school. I did extensive research from firsthand accounts of what these boys went through at the school, both those who made it out because the school closed or those who escaped at some point. I also talked to somebody who lived close to the school while it was operating and saw boys escape and run through their backyard. I watched several documentaries that really went into the depths of how the different boys were treated. They had their own hospital so they could hide the abuses that these boys were suffering. So they would only be treated on site unless absolutely necessary for them to go elsewhere. And so I really did my best to show what everybody went through and honor the victims in the best way possible, and try to shine a light on everything that they all went through.
And obviously, I think one of the things that is so great about each of your books, but also is the setting each of you have chosen and the authenticity there. I guess each of the settings in your books are almost a character unto themselves, whether it's San Francisco, whether it's the Dozier Academy, Meghan, whether it's, you look at Yellowstone National Park, Ravens Gap. How important is setting to you, and what do you do? Obviously, you want to put a reader into these worlds. Some of them are real worlds, but you want to give them the sights and sounds and smells. And obviously it can be trickier, especially if writing historical, can be trickier to do that than if, the place like Yellowstone exists now. But how do you go about transporting a reader into these worlds that either you've created or that you're recreating for them on the page? Meghan?
Yellowstone is one of my favorite places here in the States, and I've wanted to write a story set in that ecosystem for years. It's an area of the country that's still largely wilderness. It's rugged, untamed, and there's still an element of lawlessness even in today. I've tried to use the environment in this series as a foil for the characters, whether it's working against the character or exposing an element of their nature. And I try to do that by really delving into setting the scene and really getting that description very vivid and very visceral, and describing the sights, the sounds, the smell of the land around these characters.
JD?
Yeah, one of the things that really helps you, both you and Meghan have talked about the smells. Obviously, this was a very fragrant time in history, because I think at one point, was it Jason, you said, you could almost smell the horse shit on people's shoes, and that was
absolutely. Yeah.
Smell is a very, very evocative thing. It's, so helping get the. One of the things that really determined where you were in society at that time was how far up you were, and how literally how far up the hills you lived in the hills in San Francisco, and how good the air was. Down in the poorer areas, it was, not just, crap in the streets, but tanneries and breweries. And it was very, it was this fetid atmosphere. But as you came up the hills, into the literally more rarefied atmosphere. So that's one of the ways you can sort of show the divisions and how things were better off for some people than others. So yeah, I mean, it's very important for those things. And, like I said, one of the reasons is one of the things you can use in that context to illustrate that is, the very air around them, which is important. But, again, back to your original question, setting is extremely important because setting really is a big part of the story. It really is a determinant on where people were and where people stood.
Yeah. Dee, and how did you go about recreating the Dozier Academy?
It was really a lot easier for me than like some of my other books have been because there are so many pictures. I found diagrams online that showed how the school was laid out, which was very handy because you can't like Google Maps a school from the 1960s. So those maps, and then there was aerial footage that they took of the school at the time as well. Those were very, very helpful in figuring out how I wanted everything to be laid out and how it made sense based on the historical context.
I also had a question because after you died, there are I guess thriller elements, but there's also sort of supernatural elements to it too. How do you go about sort of blending genres to make sure that it's both seamless and that how do you not prevent one sort of element from overwhelming the other? But how do you blend multiple elements when you're writing a novel?
Honestly, with that book, I didn't mean to. It started out as just crime fiction, and then the supernatural elements just kind of grew out of nowhere. And it's hard to explain without giving away why the supernatural elements exist at all in the book. But essentially, at some point I was up against a wall and I was like, well, the only way I could make this happen would be some supernatural reason. And I couldn't come up with literally any other reason. So I built this entire magical supernatural portion of the book so I wouldn't have to fix a plot hole, essentially.
Usually people say like, if you're ever in doubt, like bring up, throwing a dead body or throwing to kill somebody. It's like throwing a ghost. That absolutely works too. I don't know if that would work in like 1870s San Francisco, but it's worth trying.
Well, I brought in a Chinese Tong assassin.
I think that sort of plays off the dead body thing, and it's all like it's like subgenres of the dead body bring in a killer. Right. These are obviously some of the strangest times ever to be a writer, to work in books in any way whatsoever. I think writers are used to some sort of isolation or solitude, but I think the level of isolation and solitude we've sort of been forced to have over the last year and a half is more than any of us are used to. How do you write these days? Are you able to find that isolation and solitude? Do you sort of have to find alternate ways to get your words down? Start with Meghan, but how are you able to write during the pandemic?
I have to be honest, my writing schedule, my job didn't really change that much during the pandemic. I was already working from home in a digital position. And so I still just carve out that time every morning and be really diligent and very ruthless about my writing time. And I've been able to preserve that during the pandemic.
That's good. JD?
Well, it's strange to say, but actually the COVID was one of the things that helped me get The Killing Look actually written. Because in my day job, I hate to say it, but in my day job, I'm a criminal defense lawyer. And for about 6 or 8 months there, we had only the bare minimum of court. Somebody was incarcerated, you could get a bond hearing for them or a probable cause hearing, but most other court was shut down. So basically, I got to stay home in the mornings and write. My wife, who was also my assistant and my entire staff, would basically go in, answer phone calls, answer the mail, and I'd stay home and write until noon or 1 o'clock, and then I'd go in and we could schedule hearings in the absolutely vital hearings in the afternoon. So that's how it changed my writing style. I actually got to write during the day than rather at night after work. So, silver lining, I don't know.
D, how about you?
Honestly, I feel like I've been less productive since COVID. I have written 2.5 books, but during this time period, normally I would have been able to do double that.
Wow.
But I find myself more productive when I have less time because I force myself to sit and do it like at a certain time. Whereas when I have more time available, I'm like, oh, I can just write these pages later. And then when it gets to 7 p.m., I'm like, well, I don't feel like writing. I'll just do it tomorrow. And then it's the same cycle over and over again. So I'm now like trying to get myself more disciplined and just write in the morning, because if I write it in the morning, then I typically get it done. So I need to get better about it.
So you're one of those, like, if you need something done, give it to a busy person, and you're that busy person.
Like, I don't think I could ever write full time because I would not be productive. I would be like, oh, I have 24 hours to write, cool, and then I would be on Twitter all day, and I would not get anything done. Yeah.
So as we sort of come towards the end, I wanted to ask you, unrelated to your books, but what have you read recently that you've enjoyed, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, anything at all that you would recommend to people watching this? I'll start with Meghan.
I've been rereading some of my old favorites recently. Mary Stuart, Victoria Holt, really getting into that Gothic feel for things. I've really been enjoying some of my old favorites with those.
Cool. JD?
I just finished Adrian Mckinty's The Chain, which was just absolutely fantastic. A big departure from what Adrian Mckinty usually does. It's not set in Northern Ireland. It's a really fascinating book, and I recommend it. Also, another one of the best books I've read this year has been S.A. Cosby's Razorblade Tears. I mean, that young man is going places. He's really, really good, and he deals with issues of race and sexuality in a very, very wonderful way. So those have been my two big ones. Laura Littman's Dream Girl, of course, I recently read, and Laura Littman, you can always depend on her for a really good story. So that's what I've been reading mostly.
Cool. D?
I've been reading a lot of books with my son because of COVID. So we have gone through, we just finished Magnus Chase, and we went through all of the, who's the other books by that author?
That's Rick. Is that Rick Riordan?
Yeah, his other series with the Greek, the
Percy Jackson books.
The Percy Jacksons, yes. Yeah, we went through all those as well. So we've been on a kick with all those books.
Yeah, I'll answer it too. But one of the tricky things is my pleasure reading time is almost non-existent these days. Obviously, I read a ton for work, and then sort of by the time my two girls, I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, go to bed, it's and by the time you get ready for the next day, there's almost no time. So we almost have to choose between: do I read for half an hour? Do we watch one of the millions of TV shows that I haven't caught up on? But I've been reading We Begin at the End by Chris Whitaker, which is really, really fantastic, and it's sort of this. I would say it's almost like a contemporary Western in some ways, about this sort of down and out sheriff of this small town whose best friend gets out of prison after 30 years, and he's sort of stood by this guy for 30 years, convinced that he was innocent. And then when another woman who the friend had a relationship with is murdered, and he's accused of it, the sheriff has to both prove that his friend is innocent, but then also take care of the young daughter, who's this sort of like 13-year-old force of nature. And she literally calls herself an outlaw. And she's just like a 13-year-old badass, but also this incredibly damaged young girl. And so there's sort of this dichotomy of this firebrand young girl and this sort of older, almost like Rooster Cogburn-esque lawman. And just the dichotomy there's absolutely fantastic. And it's one of the best written crime novels I think I've ever read. So I'd absolutely recommend that. So I think at this point we want to turn it over to questions from anybody watching, questions from McKenna, questions from any of you, and thank you to everybody who's watching. And I'll turn over to anyone who wants a question for the authors.
Okay, we do have a couple questions. I will add that We Begin at the End is incredible. And I totally agree about that. I put a link in the comments there on that one just because I'm so familiar with that book. I knew exactly how to find it. So we do have a question from Susan. And Susan's been watching some of these events and she asks this question each night. When she's watching, I was going to steal it and ask it if she wasn't on here tonight, but here she is. We're going to go around so everyone can answer one author. Oh, sorry. I clicked the wrong thing. There's what I meant to put on there. What 3 writers would each invite to dinner? So, like this can be living or dead. Dream dinner party with 3 authors. So, we'll do one at a time. So how about just the way that you guys are on my screen? I'll do clockwise. So Dee, you get the short straw to come up with your first pick.
This is not fair.
No, I'm sorry.
Okay, so my first choice would be I had a name in there. Chuck Palahniuk. I would absolutely love to have dinner with. And then I'm just going to say them because they're my friend, Wendy Hurd. I would love to have dinner with her as well. She is an incredible author. I love her books. And then Amina Akhtar as well. I would also love to have dinner with her.
Nice.
She wrote Fashion Victim, which is amazing. I absolutely love that book.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love that. I love that book too. That's honestly, that's one of the funniest crime novels I've ever read. It's absolutely it's phenomenal. I recommend that too.
It is amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm a hard person to make laugh out loud, and that book made me laugh out loud.
Okay, Megan?
I'm going to start with my friend Heather Harper Ellett. She's another Polis author. She wrote Ain't Nobody Nobody, which is just a tremendous read. If you've not read it yet, do yourself a favor and grab a copy. And then my other 2 would be Lauren Isley and Mary Stewart.
Nice. All right, JD?
Well, the first one, of course, comes to mind for me is Mark Twain because I'm a huge Mark Twain fan. I don't know, Laura Littman, because I've actually hung out with Laura before, and she's always a lot of fun to talk to. And for a third, I guess Mickey Spillane, because Mickey Spillane sounds like he would be a lot of fun to hang with.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure Mickey Spillane and Laura Littman at dinner together would also be quite the interesting evening.
Well, the problem is if you invited them all 3 together, nobody would get a word in edgewise with Twain.
There you go. All right, Jason, you're up.
Okay, I was just looking to see if to find a copy of Heather Harper Ellett's book because I have a bookshelf of all the Polis titles and I couldn't find it at the moment. But I just want to second what Megan said because Heather Harper Ellett, Ain't Nobody Nobody. I remember when I got that book on submission, and I remember reading it. It's a debut novel. I remember reading that book and thinking, like, this is not a debut. Like, this is not how a debut author writes. It's the kind of book where it actually reminds me of We Begin at the End in a way because every sentence is just crafted, and that's the way you put it. Like, there's a depth to almost every single sentence, whether it's humor, whether it's pathos. I love that book, so I'm glad Megan mentioned it. I'm gonna go 2 contemporary writers who are my favorites. I'm gonna go Dennis Lehane, who I've met before, we had it was like a dinner with like 20 people, so I can't say we had dinner, but just because Mystic River is probably my favorite contemporary novel of all time. And to me, that's sort of in a lot of ways the pinnacle of what the crime genre can accomplish. And I would love to pick his brain both on that book, his career, and also sort of his work in TV and film. I would go Gillian Flynn because I tell everybody that I was a huge fan of Sharp Objects way before Gone Girl came out. So I'm like one of those hipsters who's like, I was a fan of that band before they got big because I loved Sharp Objects. I loved Sharp Objects. I loved Dark Places. And then, of course, Gone Girl came out, and she became, the most famous author in the world. But I was a fan of hers way back then, so I'd want to hear all about that. And then, again, her work in TV and film. And then I would go Neil Gaiman to go 3 contemporary, just because I think he is one of those fascinating people alive. The breadth of his work in every conceivable medium, from books, TV, film, audio drama, comics, graphic novels, and I would just like get the three of them super drunk and just like pick their brains for an entire night. I think that'd be a lot of fun.
Sounds like a great dinner. It's funny. I just did a talk with James Lee Burke and Brian Panowich on Saturday, and Jim said that he considers Mystic River perhaps the best crime novel of like this generation, which is, he's so incredibly well read and he's such an incredible writer, and it was high praise coming from him too. So it's interesting. I've now heard mention of Mystic River. What is that? Twice in like 4 nights. So, okay. We don't. So here's another question. I will actually click on the correct thing this time. Where do you all see the thriller crime genre going? Darker, lighter, bringing back old tropes? And thank you. So we'll go in reverse this time. We're going to end with Jason since he's a publisher, because that's going to be a different take than everyone else. But how about we start with you, JD? What do you see happening?
One thing that I'm seeing a lot of that I think is really, really great to see is we're seeing a lot more crime writers of color, people who people like S.A. Cosby, Kelly Garrett, Steph Cha. So we're getting a lot more diverse group of viewpoints, and a lot more, a lot more different experiences being brought to the mix. And I think that's all to the good. We're seeing a lot of expansion in that.
Yeah,
so I see a lot more of that coming.
Let's hope so. Great. Absolutely. Okay, so Megan, you're next in my reverse clockwise.
Yeah, absolutely. I think over the last years, particularly since Gone Girl, we've seen this trend of women who don't fit into that strict category of good characters. And so I particularly love that trend, and I like exploring that type of character where the heroine is a little bit more of an anti-heroine. And so I hope we actually see more of that, and probably go a little bit darker as well.
Yeah. All right, Dee.
Personally, I would love to see more members of the LGBT community like myself writing more in the crime fiction genre. I would love to see it expand that way as well. I also echo the sentiment of wanting to see more crime writers of color as well. I love all the diverse voices, and so I'm really hoping we grow more that way. And I love the darkest books you can get, so I'm hoping we skew darker.
All right, Jason. I know my answer for trends, but what's your answer for trends?
I was want to respond to what Dee just said, because we actually literally just this week signed a fantastic novel for Agora that's going to be coming out next year that we sort of was pitched as sort of like a gay fatal attraction, and it's absolutely phenomenal. And it's coming out next year. I don't even think we've announced it yet, but it'll be coming out I think next summer. And it's just like I'll make sure to get you a galley, because it's just like, and I think that actually goes in line with I think some of the tropes and trends that are important to me as a reader and publisher. Is that I think for a long time, diverse writers who are writing a genre were sort of forced and pigeonholed into writing, I guess, what you might call issues books. They always had to write about, calamity and death and suffering and all this stuff. And there wasn't a lot of room, and I've heard this from those writers, there wasn't a lot of room to write, Black authors writing domestic suspense, or gay writers writing just, traditional sort of a cozy mystery or things like that. And I think I think we've seen more of it, because I think there's not only more reception for it, but there's more people more looking for it. Just diverse authors writing kind of whatever the hell they want. They don't have to write issues books. They can write great domestic suspense. They can write horror. They can write fantasy. They can write crime novels, mysteries, or cozies. And I think that's one of the things that I'm looking for, and that we're looking to do more of, is just writers who are writing classic genres and subgenres and tropes, but with characters and perspectives we haven't seen in those tropes. So domestic suspense from an LGBTQ IA plus author, things along those lines. So I'm seeing a lot more of that, and that's exciting to me as a publisher. And I came to this as a reader first and foremost, because I love reading things and characters that I have not seen before. That excites me. I don't want to read the same books over and over again. Just so to see things from a different perspective, and to see this genre that I love now, the sort of the breadth of that genre expanding to include more perspectives and more diverse perspectives is hugely exciting, both for me as a reader and a publisher and somebody who just cares about books.
Well, and I think, as I mentioned, every time we do one of these, I think it's important to recognize the fact that, like, you were OG reader for Gillian Flynn. Like, you guys started Agora with this intention before it kind of blew up into a thing recently. And so you definitely started doing this not following trends, but because it's something you believed in, which is, I think we all respect and recognize. I will mention, since everyone's talking about crime writers of color and more diverse voices, we are going to be hosting, BoucherCon was canceled, but a couple of the BoucherCon events have moved online to virtual, and we actually at Murder by the Book reached out to host the Underrepresented Voices reception. So it's going to be virtual this Friday night, and it's going to be a huge lineup from the authors of crime writers of color. So you can find information on that on our website. It'll be on Facebook. It'll be on YouTube, but there will be readings as well as a lot of recommendations in subgenres and new writers to discover. So we're happy to be doing that. It's going to be Friday at 7:30 Central. So anyway, we definitely believe in all of that too. Okay, another question. Gail was wondering, how are the authors impacted by where they live regarding their writing style? So Megan, I don't think we've started with you yet. So let's start with you on this one.
Where I currently live doesn't really play much into what I write at this point. I've written France in 1944. I've written Yellowstone. I happen to live in the foothills of the Appalachians. And so my environment that I live in, the culture that I live in, hasn't really come to the forefront of my writing at this point. Not to say that it never will, but at this point, I have been straying a little farther than my own neighborhoods.
All right, how about you, JD?
Well, Killing Look is actually the first book I think I've written, other than my one attempt at science fiction, that does not have a North Carolina connection. Devil's Right Hand, the first 4 books I wrote that were published, all were set in North Carolina, because that's where I'm from, that's where I live, that's where I spent most of my life. So right now, it's not, where I live is not really affecting that very much. But it has for almost all of the rest of my career.
How about you, Dee?
So After You Died is the only book I have based in Florida. And Florida did very much inspire that book, but all my other ones take place up north. Next Girl to Die is based in Maine, so is the sequel. And then my new series that's coming out in October, that is all set up in upstate New York. I don't know why I gravitate toward that region, maybe because I lived in Connecticut for a little while. But so far, Florida has only influenced the one.
Fair enough. Okay. So that's all of our audience questions. But as always, before I wrap up one of these Polis Agora nights, Jason, what do you have coming out that you're excited about with the press?
Well, I mean, these 3 authors, their books are just out. So obviously, After You Died and Hiding Place and Killing Look are all available, and buy them from Murder by the Book. Buy all their other books. We have an
Killing Look drops today.
That's right.
Yes.
And absolutely. And if you're watching this elsewhere, then it's already out. If you're watching this on next week, it's already out. We have an absolutely amazing fall coming up. We have Tori Eldridge, The Ninja Betrayed, the new book in her Lily Wong series, which just got a Starred Library Journal review and just got a phenomenal review in the Los Angeles Times today. All These Ashes by James Quealy. James is an award-winning reporter for the Los Angeles Times. He's literally covering the Robert Durst trial as we speak. Starred reviews from Publishers Weekly and Book List. It's the second book in his Russell Avery series. The first book, Line of Sight, came out last year. And to me, it's in terms of authors who sort of know the intersection of crime, media, race, and politics, it's James Quealy and Michael Connolly. Because the degree as a Los Angeles Times reporter and a former Newark reporter too, he knows that area backwards and forwards. October, we have a debut novel that we are so excited about called Repentance by an author named Eloisa Diaz. It's set in 1970s Argentina. And it's sort of what I would say is if Chinatown was set in Argentina in the 1970s. It's just this incredible sort of epic crime novel about an inspector in 1970s Argentina. It's a debut novel coming out in October. Standalone novel of suspense by Clea Simon. Clea writes these great cozy novels, but she has this sort of great noir suspense novel called Hold Me Down, also coming out in October. We have a terrific first book in a sort of a macabre cozy series by an author named Amita Murray. And the first book is called Arya Winters and the Tiramisu of Death. And the book is just exactly as much fun as that title sounds. So that's sort of, those are the books we have coming out in the fall. And it's an awesome like murderer's row of books in town. So we have a ton of stuff coming out. You can always go to polisbooks.com and see what we have coming out, see what we've put out recently, and just find any number of fantastic books. And
we have had lots of praise for your press in the comments. So that's... Aww. I'm sure there will be some people checking that out. Tori Eldridge is going to be at the in the virtual event Friday night, the Crime Writers of Color event, doing a reading as well, I think, from her forthcoming book. So that'll be fun. All right. Well, my dog just jumped down and is heading to the door. So before she starts barking, I'm going to sign us all off for the night. Thank you all for being with us. Congrats to you for all your new books. Jason, is always a treat. Great job interviewing. And everyone have a wonderful evening.
Thank you too.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having
me.
Thank you all.